Gabe Sterling was fuming.
It has all gone too far. It has to stop.
By December 2020, then President Donald Trump and his allies had been making false claims about election fraud for weeks. Sterling, with Georgia's Secretary of State's office, called a press conference.
Someone's going to get hurt, someone's going to get shot, someone's going to get killed.
4 years on, with another election underway, the political climate is still hot.
The FBI is warning in a bulletin to local and state officials that extremists with election grievances could turn to violence in the coming weeks.
Trump has survived 2 assassination attempts. He and his allies have already made false claims about election fraud, disaster relief, and immigrants. In some cases, false claims have fueled real-world threats.
On today's show, we take the political temperature in Georgia.
I think democracy, if we don't vote for Trump, our democracy is dead. I'm going to be real here.
It's just dividing us even more with these non-truths and made-up stories.
Plus, Trump returns to Metro Atlanta.
And former President Barack Obama enters the chat.
It is good to be back in Georgia.
And we'll untangle those confusing ballot measures.
And listen to a little Springsteen, Usher, and Jason Aldean. I'm WABE Politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
I'm WABE Politics reporter Rahul Bali, and this is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. Sam, let's start with that FBI memo. It sounds frightening. What did it say?
This warning came in a joint intelligence bulletin I obtained. The FBI advised vigilance at potential targets like polling places and campaign events, and cited incidents already this year like suspicious white powder being sent to election offices, hoax bomb threats, and again, those 2 assassination attempts against Trump. The FBI is urging specific safeguards for election infrastructure and election workers. That has already, Rahul, been a priority for election officials and law enforcement here in Georgia, and officials say voters should feel safe going to exercise their right to vote.
So let's stick with the threats around election infrastructure and election officials. That audio we heard at the top from Gabe Sterling is still kind of haunting. I remember when it happened, you sat down with him to ask how he's reflecting on the current climate 4 years later. What did you hear from him?
Well, Rahul, this was Sterling's top-line answer about how this moment compares to 4 years ago.
And I think we're more prepared this time. What I'd get concerned about is some new tactic.
Sterling says law enforcement and election officials have to be on guard to contend with this misinformation-soaked reality that's really persisted over the last few years. You know, in one security briefing, Sterling recalls law enforcement suggesting parking cars alongside a set of windows at a polling place.
Like, why? To prevent a bomb attack. I mean, that's the level we're at now of some of these things.
Rahul, Sterling hopes that the consistent message from his office promoting fair elections one day breaks the fever.
It's kind of like the end of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, when he's sitting there doing his filibuster on the floor, and finally the senator's like, listen, there's no way this guy's still saying this stuff if there's not some truth to what he's saying.
But it has not happened yet. Trump has so far declined to say he'll accept the results of this election. And, you know, in recent weeks, the Georgia State Election Board has passed rules that seem to allow local boards to vote against certifying election results if they reported uncovering irregularities or fraud. And when a judge undercut those rules, he received death threats online.
Now, I know you spent a few hours before a recent Trump rally working through the line outside, talking to the former president's supporters. How are they thinking about the threats against their candidate and also his own rhetoric?
One of the first people I met was Daryl Kidd. He was wearing a Save America hat, and 4 years ago, talk of a stolen election propelled him to Washington, D.C. on January 6th, where a mob violently breached the Capitol. Now, Kidd says he didn't participate in any of the violence that day, but he did have doubts about the 2020 election result.
This time, I think it's going to be more secure. In Georgia, anyway, I think it'll be more protected.
He says the controversial overhaul of Georgia's election laws since 2020 is giving him some more confidence, but he is less sure about the other states and says he would not rule out protesting the result again. Now, nearby, I met friends Tina McKay and Dory Walters, who were processing a more recent moment of political violence, and that's those assassination attempts against Trump. I asked them if the attempts made them hesitant to come out to their first Trump rally.
I thought about it when it first happened. I thought, oh, how scary that would be. But as soon as I was able to get a ticket here, I didn't think twice of it.
Yeah, I mean, I do fear for him because I do feel like he's got a huge target on his back.
Now, the motives of those two assassination attempts remains unclear. Walters and McKay say they blame Democrats, not Trump, for spiking the political temperature. Both campaigns have described their opponents as grave threats, but, Rahul, it's Trump's language that's often laced with violent imagery, personal attacks, and incendiary claims. At this rally, Trump called on supporters to help, quote, defeat the enemy at all levels of combat, unquote. And some of the harshest rhetoric has been targeted at immigrants.
I've been in this country 54 years. I did it the right way.
For Daniela Usarin, who's from Uruguay, Trump's hardline stance is actually welcome. She says illegal immigration reflects poorly on immigrants like her. But I asked, what about Trump's false claims about legal migrants in Springfield, Ohio? He said on the debate stage they were eating pets, and it wasn't true, but the city became overwhelmed with bomb threats anyways.
As far as those issues in Ohio, I really can't say what's the reality.
The reality is that those claims are false, but many at the Trump rally say they believe them.
And I imagine that is causing fear in many immigrant communities.
Rahul, last Saturday I went to a Democratic canvassing kickoff at Peachy Corners Cafe in Peachtree Corners in the Metro Atlanta suburbs, and I spoke to volunteers who were picking up campaign flyers, Vietnamese coffee, and bubble tea.
It's just dividing us even more with these non-truths and made-up stories.
Tamita Shamsuddin immigrated from Bangladesh almost 3 decades ago.
And I never felt like I was anything less than, because I got a job and became, what I hope is a contributing citizen. And it's personal for me and it's hurtful.
Shamsuddin was wearing a Harris Walls hat, and while she says she's committed to this campaign work, she also says that knocking on strangers' doors to talk about the election can be really anxiety-inducing in this moment. For some Asian Americans, the threat of violence has already been on their minds. In 2021, a shooter killed 6 women of Asian descent at spas around Atlanta. Volunteer Nathania Adhisti moved from Indonesia as a toddler, and now whenever she drives by one of those spas,
I always think about how, that could have been my dad, that could have been my mom, that could have been a family friend.
At a high top by the espresso machine, Ta Vin came in for a quiet spot to read his comic books.
I'm a gun owner. I want to vote Republican, but the rhetoric towards immigrants has been something that has made me not want to vote Republican.
Vin came to the U.S. as a refugee from Cambodia in 1980, and he actually remembers, Rahul, his family receiving a welcome basket. But these days, he feels that spirit has really faded, though the political climate has actually toughened his resolve to go to the polls with his family, including his 3 kids who all just turned 18.
I want us as a family to, vote in a way that shows that we're part of this country.
Vin says he sees his vote as more than a choice for president. It's a way to assert he belongs in the country that gave him refuge all those years ago.
Sam, thank you so much for all this reporting. Let's take a break. This is Plugged In, a WABE Politics Podcast. Welcome back to Plugged In, a WABE Politics Podcast.
All right, 2 big rallies this week. We're in the final countdown to Election Day. Former President Barack Obama campaigned with Vice President Kamala Harris in Metro Atlanta, and former President Donald Trump held a big rally with a packed lineup of right-wing celebrities like Tucker Carlson and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And Rahul, just the musical guest this week really illustrated the split screen that we're watching unfold. Obama was joined by the boss, Bruce Springsteen.
Evening, Atlanta.
And last weekend, Usher spoke at another Harris rally in Atlanta. I also saw him do a Get Out the Vote event at a roller skating rink, Cascade Skating here in Atlanta.
Let me make certain that I'm talking to all my AT aliens out here. We ready What?
And Trump had country star Jason Aldean.
Georgia is so important to this election. It is a swing state, and every vote is necessary. So do not sit this one out. Get out and vote. Vote early if you can.
So, Rahul, you covered that Trump rally this week. Tell me what stood out to you.
First of all, as you mentioned, the lineup was packed with names loved in the Trump world. But the other thing that jumped out at me with this specific rally was the number of times that it felt like a religious rally or a revival, not just in tone, but in content. Charlie Kirk is the founder of Turning Point. That's a conservative organization that focuses on colleges and high schools. Kirk himself has been called a conservative provocateur. He goes to college campuses to argue with students, including Georgia State University this week. Wednesday's rally was actually a Turning Point event that featured Trump versus, a traditional campaign event. Here's a little of what Kirk told the crowd at Gas South Arena in Gwinnett County.
In a series of events that only God could orchestrate, in a series of events that only our divine Father could put together, the most unusual set of circumstances is that a billionaire from New York had to get in the arena to tell the other billionaires that have been robbing you, the game is over, you're fired, and the American people are back in charge again.
As for Trump, his speech sounded very similar to what he did in Cobb County last week, with him and many other speakers imploring the crowd, most of who have already voted, to get others to go to the polls. Sam, you covered the Harris-Obama event that was the very next night. Same question to you.
This rally drew about 20,000, according to the campaign, to a high school football field in DeKalb County. Obama has been out on the trail for Harris already this month, but this was their first joint appearance of the campaign, so it felt like a real moment, and like the campaigns are beginning to deliver their closing message with 11 days left. Obama can still energize a crowd probably like no other Democrat. Let's listen.
Real strength is about working hard and taking responsibility and telling the truth even when it's inconvenient. Real strength is about helping people who need it and standing up for those who can't always stand up for themselves. That's what we should want in our daughters and our sons. And that's what I want to see in the President of the United States of America.
Harris fondly mentioned campaigning for Obama in Iowa in 2008, and at one point a chant broke out in the crowd of "Yes, we can," the iconic slogan of that campaign. Harris needs to retain and expand the Obama coalition, young voters, people of color, women, suburbanites, and Obama still may be the glue that holds a lot of these groups together. And the star-studded rally, though, was designed to appeal to some of those different constituencies. Not only did you have Bruce Springsteen, but also Tyler Perry, Samuel L. Jackson, and Spike Lee.
And Sam, I also wanted to fit in an important development this week as the Georgia Supreme Court declined to reinstate controversial new rules passed by the state election board ahead of the 2024 election.
Yeah, that's right. The Republican Party of Georgia and the RNC asked the state high court to reinstall 7 rules for the election after a judge last week found them, quote, illegal, unconstitutional, and invalid. The rules included changes to how local election boards certify results and also mandating a hand count of the number of ballots cast on election day. Election officials warned that the last-minute changes advanced by Republican state election board members who had been praised by former President Donald Trump could create confusion or disruptions. So these rules will not be in effect for this upcoming election, but the Georgia Supreme Court still likely next year has to consider whether the rules should remain blocked permanently.
This is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast. This week, Georgia's early in-person voters crossed the 2 million threshold, so people are already getting those votes in. And something I've gotten a lot of questions on from folks in text messages or emails is what should I do on these ballot measures that are at the bottom of the ballot? So I want to talk about those, Rahul. Describe just first generally how ballot measures work and what they're for.
So in most cases, when you change something structural in state or local government, that's going to involve changing Georgia's state constitution. And that's exactly what's going on here. Changes involving how property taxes and legal tax cases are handled. And before we get to these two amendments, Sam, let me mention what happens in the legislature. These have to pass the state house and state senate with 2/3 majority. That means they have to be bipartisan. Also, the governor has no say-so on constitutional amendments.
Okay, let's start with this first measure. This is a constitutional amendment focused on homestead exemptions and property taxes. Explain.
So, Sam, this is the one I've gotten the most questions about. Constitutional Amendment 1 would create a new statewide homestead exemption. Now, the stated goal is to curb property tax hikes for current homeowners at their primary residence. Look, when home values rise, generally property taxes rise. But with this proposed exemption, the state would put a cap on how much that home valuation could go up. It could not outpace inflation. So if inflation went up 1%, then that valuation could only go up 1%. Now, if voters approve this state amendment, cities and counties could choose to opt out of this new exemption, but they're required to hold a series of public meetings and adopt a resolution. All of that said, there's going to be a discussion around the law of unintended consequences or even intended consequences if this takes effect in your area. Atlanta-based property tax attorney Sarah Sorensen brought one of those to light talking with WABE's Stephanie Stokes.
I think that it's important to remember that property taxes usually fund a significant part of the budgets of local cities, counties, and school districts. And when you start capping that revenue, the revenue has to come from somewhere else.
So what does that mean then for local governments who don't opt out?
So, Sam, if governments need to raise revenues, they're going to have to find different ways, whether it's new or higher sales taxes or new fees. And I want to mention two other things. When new homeowners buy a property, their tax bill is going to reset with the new home value. And again, let's talk about the idea of unintended consequences and how this could possibly affect home sales. Look, when my wife and I bought homes in the past, not only did we look at the cost of the home, we would actually look at what the property tax bills in the past are. Well, whatever is listed there may not represent what a new homeowner will pay because of the reset. And finally, this is for primary residents, so landlords would not qualify for the exemption, which means renters may not see any savings as well.
Now let's talk about tax courts.
Woo! Okay, so this is Constitutional Amendment number 2. It would create a Georgia State Tax Court with statewide jurisdiction alongside Georgia's Superior Courts. Here's what that really means. Right now, Fulton County Superior Court hears appeals to any tax tribunal case. Look, a couple of things going on here. First of all, we've heard of all the stories about the backlogs and issues with the Fulton County courts. That's going to relieve some of those issues for both Fulton and for those who are dealing with tax tribunal cases. Second, State Representative Chuck Martin, who was the lead legislative sponsor on this amendment, believes that superior courts were never meant to be an appeals court. They don't specialize in tax law. This amendment would assure that this court, along with the Georgia Court of Appeals, would handle those cases and those multiple appeals. Let me also address one question that I have received and lawmakers are also getting, and that is if you are representing yourself in your tax case, you will still be able to do that if you go before this statewide court. Representative Martin says, look, the intent is not to change rules around tax tribunals, just the venue.
Finally, Rahul, there is a measure on personal property tax exemptions.
So this is not a constitutional amendment. Rather, this is a statewide referendum on a tax-related issue. This is kind of like when you and I vote on a sales tax referendum. This referendum, Referendum A, is an attempt to update a law around the exemption for tangible personal property that was last updated in 2002. What are we talking about here? We're talking about, office supplies and equipment for a small business, for example. If approved by voters, it would move the exemption from $7,500 to $20,000. But interestingly, the law of unintended consequences was talked about this. There was a bigger number on the table, Sam, but local governments were concerned about what this would mean for their bottom line. So the compromise was reached to get the number to 20,000. Look, this is really about smaller businesses and their ability to get the stuff they need to run their businesses.
Whew. All right. That is it for this edition of Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast.
Our producer is Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
We also highly recommend new work by our colleague Dormaya Vance, who spoke to 3 mayors about being Black women in office. This is College Park Mayor Bianca Motley Broom.
We are prepared. We are overly prepared for what we do. Yet we still face those questions about, does she know what she's doing? Does she have the skill set to do this work? And that can be disappointing because I don't think those questions have been asked of those who have sat in the seats before us. But I think we prove it every day.
You can find the whole conversation on the WABE YouTube channel or at WABE.org. Also, thanks to Dormaya for providing the early voters you heard at the top of last week's show.
You can get more politics at WABE.org/election2024 and tune in to our live election night coverage streaming and at 90.1. We'll talk to you next week.